Thank you, Laurie, and thanks everybody for being here today. It's an incredibly important conversation that we're having. The report that Laurie referred to, the Social Policy Framework, is in your packages. We just released it in October. It's a new framework for addressing disparity, social and economic disparity in Alberta. It builds on the report we released in 2010, a social policy framework that had a broad and comprehensive vision for addressing disparity in the province. What we released in October in the report was new data on Alberta's top 1% and top 10%, as well as CEO salaries. So we were able to illustrate some of the disparity in Alberta more clearly. And I want to quote a famous economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, to start out on Trickle-Down Economics, because that's what we're really talking about here when we talk about disparity, is does wealth trickle down? And he referred to it as the horse and sparrow theory. And accordingly, if you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through to the road for the sparrows. This is an economist's take on how effective trickle-down is. Alberta is an excellent case in point. What we've illustrated in this report is that Alberta has the richest rich and the poorest poor in the nation. We have the highest concentration of wealth and average incomes for the top income brackets, and the most intense poverty at the lower income bracket. And what I want to talk about is a disparity approach. We've been talking a lot about poverty so far in this forum, and in a lot of the debates around poverty, it's really focused on absolute income rather than relative income. And it's very important to talk about both. Absolute income matters, poverty matters, income matters for things like health and well-being. But relative income also matters. And studies have shown that relative income, so the difference between low income and top income and inequality, matters across a broad range of indicators of well-being, but also for the economy. It matters for both economic and social well-being, and I'll address these in turn. First, social well-being. The landmark study on this, of course, is The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett. And in our report, we do a summary of some of the correlations that they find of unequal societies, and I'll just summarize a few. Less equal societies have shorter life expectancies, higher infant mortality, higher rates of mental illness, higher rates of illegal drug use, higher addictions rates, lower education outcomes, less equal societies imprison more of their citizens. They have higher rates of obesity, less social mobility. They have lower trust. They have less social cohesion and family cohesion. They have higher rates of violence and homicide. Children are the victims of more violence. And the list goes on. What they find is that across a broad range of indicators of well-being, relative income matters as well as absolute income. Now I want to turn to the economic side, because that's the focus of my talk, the economic question. And recent studies from places like the International Monetary Fund, not usually a bastion of left-wing thought, and the World Bank, similarly, and the Conference Board of Canada, arguably also, have found that inequality matters for the economy. Too much inequality is actually bad for the economy. Again, trickle-down doesn't work. In the International Monetary Fund study, what they did was they looked at a broad range of factors that they know correlate with economic growth. So things like political stability, trade openness, exchange rate competitiveness, external debt, foreign direct investment, and they included income distribution. And interestingly, the factor that they found had the most robust correlation with growth, economic growth, was income distribution. Of all those factors, the thing that mattered most for the duration of the economic growth periods was how equally income was distributed within an economy. So what we've seen now is that not only does inequality matter for all of our well-being and security, but it also matters for everyone in terms of our economy. So that's why I'm using a disparity approach, an approach which encompasses both poverty and inequality, to talk not just about what happens to the low income, but also how it compares with how everybody else is doing. And what I want to do is illustrate, before I go into the solutions, illustrate briefly what Alberta looks like. So we'll go through the slides. I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about how Alberta's gap is growing, the rich, the top, and a little bit about the bottom. And then I will look to the economic solutions, both tax reform and social spending, where we have room to move. Next slide. I'm going to start by looking at the top and the bottom. What you can see here is that the highest income bracket, incomes have dramatically risen over the course of the boom. And you can see that the bottom income bracket does not have a similar increase in income. Next slide. This is an interesting graph, and it shows that if we were to split this room and the room in Calgary down the middle, with 50% on one side and 50% on the other, and we put half of households on one side and half on the other, what we would see is that 87% of the income would go to one side of the room, leaving 50% of Alberta households with access to 13% of total income, household income. 50% of households have access to 13% of household income. Next slide. If we were to break the room into 10 groups, or what we call income deciles, what you would see is that the top income bracket has access to almost 30% of the total household income. So 10% of households have access to almost a third of household income. The lowest income bracket, 1.7% of household income. What we see in this graph is the increase in the concentration of income in the hands of the top 1%. It's gone from 8% to over 14% of income is concentrated in the hands of the top 1% here in Alberta. Now you can see the blue line is Canada. You can see that it also has risen across Canada. Inequality is growing across our nation, but it is dramatically higher in terms of concentration here in Alberta. This slide shows the top 1% in terms of average incomes, and here in this graph you can really see what an outlier Alberta is. Alberta is the line on the left. Over $675,000 per year is the average income for the top 1%. And the threshold to get into the top 1%, which is the orange line, is the highest in the nation. So Alberta's top 1% have the highest average incomes in Canada. We have by far the wealthiest top 1%. This is just a graph that illustrates CEO salaries, because of course they're a big driver of this. This is actually the 2009 data. We actually have, 2007 data. In the report, you'll see the 2009 data, that it's actually at the top 11 million, over 11 million per year for the top 5 CEOs, average income over 11 million per year. Imagine what you could do with $11 million in a year. Compared to a median income of $68,100 for the median Albertan. So as, of course, this contrasts with Alberta having the most intense poverty in the nation. We don't have the most people in poverty, but those who are in poverty are the furthest from the poverty line. So we have the highest concentration of wealth and the highest concentration of poverty. Of course, that high concentration of poverty is disproportionately borne, as has been mentioned earlier, by Aboriginal folks, women, and new Canadians. We also can look at social disparity. It's not just about economic inequality. There's a big piece to the inequality puzzle that is about access to things like community services, recreation, culture, leisure, healthcare, education. And what we've seen is that disparity in this area has also been growing. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the biggest factors in terms of social disparity, which is working hours, because this is an indicator of leisure time. And Albertans work some of the highest hours in the country, and Canada is 4th for the OECD in terms of work hours. So what we see is that Albertans work some of the highest hours in the developed world. Or if you flip that over, Albertans have some of the least leisure time the least time to parent, to be families, the least time to engage in communities, to attend soccer games, community functions, to volunteer, to help family members in need, support elderly or sick family members. Albertans have the least leisure time in Canada. And what this means is that we are unraveling the fabric that keeps our communities together, our social fabric. And Albertans also have the lowest sense of belonging to our communities in the nation. So what we did in the social policy framework in 2010 was came up with a large and comprehensive policy agenda that includes both economic and non-economic policy recommendations. I'm on the agenda today to speak about the economic, so I'll limit myself to that, but I will just mention that we do have in the agenda a broad range of policy recommendations that haven't yet been talked about today, such as democratic reform. In order to address inequality and disparity, we need to address problems of functional democracy in this province. We also look at reform of labor standards and employment standards. We look at recommendations around improving the employment standards for non-traditional work, improving enforcement of it, improving labor legislation, because Alberta has the lowest unionization rate and is fairly anti-union. So improving labor legislation to support workplace democracy and protections for workers. Looking at community service models that move away from a reliance on volunteerism and charity to one that's based on rights and core service delivery. A community service model that ensures that community service delivery in the third sector has full parity in terms of both wages and benefits with the public sector. So we have a broad range of non-economic policy recommendations that are critical to setting a framework for redistribution in the province that ensures proper democracy, protection of workers, and community service delivery. Now I'll turn to the economic side. First thing I want to talk about is the flat tax. When we talk about disparity, we've got to talk about Alberta's flat tax. What you can see in this graph is that the flat tax guarantees that lower income Albertans pay some of the highest taxes in the nation, while high income Albertans pay the lowest by far. So this is a big factor in Alberta's inequality puzzle, and progressive tax reform and the reinstitution of progressive taxes is a critical first step. Other provinces are doing it already. Ontario and Quebec have talked about raising taxes on the wealthy, and they already have progressive taxes and higher taxes on the wealthy. So here we can see that Alberta has plenty of room to move in terms of tax reform at both the top and bottom ends of the income scale. This is one of my favorite slides because I get it from the government's budget document, and it shows Alberta at 0 and every other province. What this shows is that if Alberta was to have the tax structure of any other province, what we would get in revenues. So Alberta's at 0. Saskatchewan's the nearest province to us in terms of tax structures. If we were to have the tax structure of the next province up, we would collect $11 billion more in revenues today. $11 billion today, and still be tied for lowest tax jurisdiction in Canada. What that tells us is that the government has a lot of room to move on taxes while maintaining its competitive advantage. I would argue, of course, that companies are not locating in Alberta because of low taxes. They're here for natural resources, and we should be charging them a premium, not a discount, because developing natural resources has massive social costs in terms of inflation and housing affordability and infrastructure related to extracting those resources. So if we were to charge slightly higher taxes than the lowest tax jurisdiction, because the resources are here, we could be charging, say, closer to the average, $16 billion more per year. So whether you take the leap of faith and believe we need to have the lowest taxes, or you look at a more sophisticated discussion of competitive advantage and argue that we need to be investing in human resources and infrastructure to be competitive, regardless, there is at least $11 billion, if not $16 billion, on the table today for spending on social programs and infrastructure to invest in redistribution of income. Go ahead. This shows corporate taxes. The little red line at the bottom you can barely see is what we capture in revenues off of corporate profits. And the rest is what the corporations are keeping in their pockets. That's net profit. Important to note is the bulk of this is oil and gas, and over 70% of that is foreign owned, which means that those revenues left on the table are not only leaving the communities and the province, but they're leaving the country. So failure to capture this revenue in corporate taxes means we are losing that money that we could be investing in our communities today to create jobs and economic growth. So again, plenty of room to move. Social program spending is another area where we have room to move. The government would like us to believe there's only one side to the balance sheet, and that's spending. So there's lots of talk about the need for spending cuts. I've shown you that we can talk about the revenue side of the balance sheet too, and that there's lots of room for change on the revenue side. But there is also room for change on the spending side. You can see in this graph that spending relative to the size of our economy fell in the Klein cuts and has never recovered. Alberta can afford our social programs, and we can afford to do better. Some of the agenda that was laid out this morning by the important work on poverty reduction and in our report on inequality lays out a policy agenda for improved spending on things like early learning programs, childcare, on Aboriginal programs, on improving access to universities, investing in post-secondary education. All of these programs, something like a guaranteed annual income, all of these programs are eminently affordable. There is no economic constraint to that in terms of either spending or revenues. It's a conversation, it needs to be a conversation about what provides the best outcomes in terms of program delivery. Moving away from stigmatized programs like deserving and undeserving poor created by the Klein cuts to more universal program delivery, living wages and adequate incomes for all. And there is obviously economic room for us to move that direction. And I'll end with returning back to the horse and the sparrow and saying we need a broad policy reform agenda that ensures redistribution of income and a rights-based approach to ensure that it isn't just oats left on the road for the most vulnerable. Thank you.